All right. Upcoming courses again. Next week on Tuesday, I will have a lecture on Saint Juliana of Liège and the origins of the Feast of Corpus Christi. Then the End of Days, Death, Judgment, Heaven, and Hell, 3-week online course with Derek Barr. And those are Tuesdays and Thursdays with both a morning and an evening session, and there will be video recordings provided. On June 6th, Julia Greeley, Colorado Secret Angel of Charity, a free online lecture by Claire Nowak, and then a 6-week online class with Daniel Campbell on natural and human law, excuse me, beginning the last week of July and continuing into the first week of September. And again, it's a Tuesday, Thursday evening and morning class. We'll begin in prayer in the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Salve Regina, Mater Misericordiae, vita dulcedo et spes nostra, salve. A te clamamus, exules filii Eve, a te suspiramus, gementes et flentes, in hoc lacrimarum vale. Ea ergo, advocata nostra, illos tuos misericordias oculos, ad nos converte. Et Iesum, benedictum fructum ventris tui, nobis post hoc auxilium ostende. O clemens, O pia, O dulcis, Virgo Maria. The Father and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. All right, so I've once again managed to give myself an impossible task of trying to lecture on the four quartets in a single session. T.S. Eliot, in many ways, is the most medieval modern poet. And by that, I mean some of the tendencies, the features that we find in medieval poetry are tendencies that we find in T.S. Eliot more strongly than anybody else. Probably the most like Dante in terms of density. The four quartets is not long, but it is extremely dense. In terms of just pure poetry, every word is selected for a specific reason. It has the right sound, it has the precise meaning, it is exactly where it needs to be. The result of that is, if there was a record for poetry that makes you say, I understand every word individually, but I have no clue about the order in which he's put them, T.S. Eliot probably gets the award for that. But the four quartets is just absolutely magnificent. It is the final poem in a movement known as modernism, and the greatest, in my mind, by far the greatest Catholic poem of the 20th century. Even though it's not necessarily ostensibly Catholic. T.S. Eliot, in a sense, began the modernist movement in the 1910s. And modernism is a particular ideological view that informs art. It's extremely self-conscious. Modernism is an absolute rejection of everything that came before. The idea that the modernists had is that the entire world before World War I pretty much didn't count for anything and had nothing to say to the modern age, that the horrors of World War I were such that you had to start completely over again. And so it's completely self-referential. When you look at modernist poetry or art, all that matters, I mean, and that it's modern, that is the here and now, right now, without any reference to any past or future. And Eliot is one of the poets that begins this movement. And then 30 years later, he pretty much brings it to an end with the four quartets. Eliot's known best for The Wasteland, but Four Quartets as poetry is just undeniably it's superior. The Wasteland is very modernist in depicting the waste of the modern world, the horrors, the carnage, the pointless existence that's felt by so many. Four Quartets moves far beyond that and points to the way out. And the way out is the only way. And that's what the entire Four Quartets is built upon, is finding the way out of this uh, inferno that we've created for ourselves on Earth. And that way out is the only way out that there is, which is humility and acceptance of the will of God. But since he's a modernist poet writing to an unbelieving age, we talk about living in a post-Christian society in America now. It's become a very popular phrase in the last 10 years or so. But Eliot is absolutely writing in a post-Christian age. Modernism puts Christianity in the bucket with everything else that pretty much needs to be ignored. So the task that Eliot takes up for himself is to create this poetic monument that points the way to salvation. But he does that using the vocabulary of modernism. God, Christ, gospel, these words appear nowhere in the text, but are indicated everywhere. And so for all of the self-pitying agony of modernism, the Four Quartets is a very harsh poem in a lot of ways. Um, but it's an incredibly self-confident poem because, again, it points our way out of this. Eliot is writing, interestingly enough, about the same time as Tolkien. Tolkien didn't care very much for Eliot. I'm not sure what his opinion of his poetry was, but T.S. Eliot's persona as, you know, the arbiter of poetic taste, Tolkien did not care for at all. But there's a lot of similarities between the two. Above all, there is the certainty of redemption and salvation, but a refusal to look past the horrors that we do experience. The whole point of the Lord of the Rings in the last half of the last book is that even though the battle and the war has been won, evil is defeated, but it's never completely erased. And the traces of evil and the horrors of that war will live on in the lives of everyone who partook of it. With T.S. Eliot in the Four Quartets, above all, it's not an escape. For T.S. Eliot, any kind of escape is antithetical to the purpose of humankind, that we are created to know, love, and serve God. And we're not going to have a mystical escape away from this world as the Gnostics would have. So Eliot will very squarely confront the world and all of its horrors. And he's writing most of this during World War II. The first movement, the first piece of this, Bert Norton, was written in 1935, but the three remaining parts were written between 1940 and 1942. And during that time, Eliot was in London working as one of the watchers who was on the streets of London at night during the Blitz, identifying fires that needed to be put out, dealing with the horrors of the bombing on a nightly basis. As I was trying to think of images that could be shared for the Four Quartets, it's not a poem that lends itself easy to such images. I don't think, I'm not aware of anyone who has taken up the task of trying to illustrate it. But the image of London burning during the Blitz in the background seemed the most appropriate image. So Bert Norton. Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. What might have been is an abstraction remaining a perpetual possibility, only in a world of speculation. What might have been and what has been point to one end, which is always present. So what exactly does it mean that he calls this the four quartets? He's not referring to the four individual poems. Uh, each poem itself is a quartet. And a quartet in music, of course, is just the sound created by four stringed instruments playing together. So in each of these poems, there's some kind of overall music that's created by different themes, words, ideas working together. What those are, there's absolutely no certainty on. The interpretation that I like the best, because it's the least self-assured, is that we're talking about the four elements of the pre-modern universe: fire, water, air, and earth. And that doesn't mean that there's one element assigned to each section, because it's a quartet. So all four elements are in each section. One element may dominate in one section, but it's an interplay. And the four pieces, since it's an interplay, we also have these ideas that come back again and again. So if you took the course that I did on Petrarch, where you saw these words that were coming back through 366 poems, and there was this meaning that accreted to them over the course of reading that lyric sequence, that's exactly what happens in the four quartets. So the idea of time, past, present, and future, is one of the most core concepts. And the experience of time. So if present, past, and future are all contained within each other, all time is eternally present, which can only happen if there is no contingency in the world, if everything is fated, if there is, whether it's scientific determinism or any other kind, then all time is unredeemable. That is, all of the experiences, all of the horrors that we experience in life cannot be accounted for. There is nothing that will make everything okay in the end. But we can look to, I mean, that idea is rejected. There is a relation between past, present, and future, but they are not deterministically bound. They all point to one end, which is always present. And the one end we can know, and we say confidently at the beginning, the one end is God. The word God will never appear in this, but that's clearly the one end. What is the end? And with Eliot, um, there's a lot of reasons to dislike Eliot. He's absolutely an intellectual snob. He tries his best not to be. He's less of it towards the end of his life. But he's part of that generation that grows up learning Latin and Greek. Uh, he masters other languages early on. He ends up doing graduate studies in Sanskrit and Eastern Asian religious traditions. And he writes his poetry with a bit of an air of a superior, no, not a bit, with an air of superiority. He doesn't do this quite as much in the four quartets. But in The Wasteland, he included his own footnotes so that he could explain to his readers exactly what he meant by the random references to Buddhist or Hindu thought, or phrases in German or whatnot. But the word end here has a lot of meanings in English. One of the meanings that he's playing upon is the word that would be telos in Greek. The telos of something is that for which it is created. Aristotle and Aquinas would describe this as something's final cause. Why did God make man? What is the purpose of man? What is the end of man in that sense? In English, you have this wonderful ambiguity because end has several different meanings. Uh, but pointing to the one end here is the telos of man, which is God, which will come up later on in this as that still point that the dance of the universe centers around. Footfalls echo in the memory down the passage which we did not take, towards the door we never opened into the rose garden. 2.5 lines that are very simple and straightforward, that make no literal sense, but have this kind of incantatory power to them. Down the passage, footfalls echo in the memory, down the passage we did not take, towards the door we never opened into the rose garden. My words echo thus in your mind. And this is Eliot the poet, the one who has the ability to use words to capture imagination, to lead us somewhere. And he's going to lead us somewhere for a purpose, and that is to figure out what is this end, which everything's pointing to. And it's not an easy journey. But to what purpose? Disturbing the dust on a bowl of rose leaves, I do not know. And the bowl of rose leaves here, we think of the old practice of potpourri, in which rose leaves and other aromatics would be allowed to dry out and then just set in bowls around the house. And in that image of the bowl of rose leaves, you have time past and time present. The dried out rose leaf is the past rose. It's beyond what its purpose in life was, but it lingers with us here in the present. The present that is separated from it by the fact that it's dried out, and also that there's dust upon us. And this brings up another point about Eliot's poetry. Eliot is not big into symbols or metaphors. He'll use some here or there, but very little. What he's interested in is what one of his commentators, in my mind, the best commentator, describes as cases in point. He doesn't insert something that means something else. He inserts something that shows what he's talking about. So a bowl of rose leaves here doesn't symbolize the passage of time or the difference between past and present. It literally is a case in point of the past in the present. Other echoes inhabit the garden. Shall we follow them? Quick, said the bird, find them round the corner. Through the first gate into our first world, shall we follow the deception of the thrush into our first world? And we're entering this garden that's inaccessible because it's down the passage we didn't take behind a door we didn't open. But a bird appears and instructs us to follow them, to follow these echoes into the garden, that first gate, our first world, that is Eden. The thrush is apparently, and I'm only picking this up from footnotes, I don't actually know, the thrush is said to have one of the most beautiful songs. So the deception of the thrush is the beauty of that most beautiful bird song that invites us back into our first world, Eden paradise. And in virtually every tradition that there is, humanity has a yearning for this lost past, the lost past in which everything was as it should be, uncorrupted, uncorrupted by the stain, the horror of sin that we see all around us in the world. There they were, dignified, invisible, moving without pressure over the dead leaves in the autumn heat through the vibrant air, and the bird called in response to the unheard music hidden in the shrubbery, and the unseen eye beam crossed, for the roses had the look of flowers that are looked at. And what exactly that means? How do roses have the look of roses that are looked at? From the standpoint of man, of course, the point of a rose is to be looked at because it's beautiful. A rose that is looked at is fulfilling one of its roles. Um, but to suggest that a rose that is looked at is somehow different um, and is observably different is, from a purely modernist perspective, absurd. From a materialist perspective, it's absurd. But at this point in his life, Eliot no longer has a scientific materialist perspective. Eliot and all of the four quartets are only understandable with a sacramentalist view. And what do we mean by the sacramentalist viewpoint? What that is, in its simplest terms, I think, would be that timelessness and time converge in physical objects. That concrete reality is not just a series of accidents of matter coming together in some form, but eternity, that is, divinity, meets creation in particular objects, whether it's Noah's Ark or the tabernacle or the Ark of the Covenant or the cross, the nails, and the hill of Calvary itself. Objects have meaning because from the sacramentalist viewpoint, everything has meaning. Everything has a purpose. Everything was created with its own unique telos, or the end for which it was created. So from a materialist perspective, the idea of flowers that are looked at being somehow different is absurd. But from a sacramentalist viewpoint, a rose that is fulfilling its purpose in some way should be different from a rose that isn't. There they were as our guests, accepted and accepting. So we moved in a formal pattern along the empty alley into the box circle to look down into the drained pool. And the box circle there. Again, we have Eliot playing with the ambiguity of language. Um, that if we're on an estate, and Bert Norton, the name there comes from an old 17th century English estate, uh, which got its name because the original structure had been burned to the ground. So, in the sense of an English estate, a box circle would be the hedges along a path composed of boxwood. But of course, it's also in high society, the box circle is the ground floor in the opera. In both cases, though, what we're talking about is something that is dignified, elevated, formalized, and beautiful. But to look down into the drained pool, the pool, dry concrete, brown edged, and the pool was filled with water out of sunlight, and the lotus rose, quietly, quietly, the surface glittered out of the heart of light, and they were behind us, reflected in the pool. Then a cloud passed and the pool was empty. And in just that moment, the vision's gone. Go, said the bird. For the leaves were full of children, hidden excitedly containing laughter. Go, 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 said the bird. Humankind cannot bear very much reality. And of the themes that come over again and again and again, this one, humankind cannot bear very much reality. What does that mean? Well, on the one hand, it's just the literal truth. The reality of water or fire are great, but too much of either one burns and drowns. Reality itself here for Eliot and what he describes as Anglo-Catholic viewpoint, um, that reality is God, and humankind cannot bear that. We look to scriptures, and in the Old Testament, the basic understanding that to look upon God would be to die because you couldn't do it. When there is a theophany, when God is made manifest, it's in the form of a burning bush, not God in all of his glory, because man on earth could not handle that. Later on, Eliot will refer to something that saves us from salvation and damnation. What he means by that is that the eternal realities are far too much for us to bear in this life. And the tragedy of this basic human flaw, this humankind cannot bear very much reality, is that we don't accept that and move positively, trying to accept the bits of reality of God that we can. Instead, we turn from it entirely, uh, distracted by distraction from distraction is a line that he will use that perfectly encapsulates the human condition. Humankind cannot bear very much reality. Uh, you can think of that reality as with a capital R. He's not going to put that there yet. But humankind cannot bear the divine, and yet we're made for that. We have that as our end. So how are we going to get to that end, which we cannot accept as we are right now? And that is the path. Time past and time future, what might have been and what has been point to one end, which is always present. And that end, of course, is God. And that end, which has been, what will be, which is always present in terms of the sacramental viewpoint, um, is the Mass. It is the Eucharist. It is the Eucharist, what has been in the crucifixion, what will be in Revelations, the banquet of the Lamb, what is always present, the sacrifice of the Mass that goes on without end all over the earth. That is what it points to. That is the reality. But we can't bear that. And each of the four poems are divided into five parts. And there's patterns that we'll see in all of the five parts. The first part deals with a specific geographical location that fixes us and introduces some of the problem of our human state. The second part tends to abstract that and make it more of a problem of, like, I guess, individual geography, the problems of the human soul. So garlic and sapphires in the mud clawed the bedded axle tree. The trilling wire in the blood sings below inveterate scars, appeasing long forgotten wars. The dance along the artery, the circulation of the lymph, are figured in the drift of stars. Ascend to summer in the trees, we move above the moving tree, in light upon the figured leaf, and here upon the sodden floor below, the boarhound and the boar pursue their pattern as before, but reconciled stars. And so we have all of these images here thrown together that would seem to have nothing to do with each other. Um, how different can garlic and sapphires be? Garlic, pungent, sapphires, beautiful. But both of them are in the mud and caught the bedded axle tree. So both of them are in the mud and mucking up our attempts to get through the axle of our wagon or car. And we get into the question of the dance and the pattern. And that's the dance and the pattern we'll see all throughout this. The dance along the artery, the circulation of the lymph, figured in the drift of stars. And the boar hunt. Circulation of the blood does not seem particularly poetic. The lymph system seems even less poetic, but so is garlic. And this is what Eliot does. He has this particular poetic voice that is always calm and reserved. Dante, at points, soars above and preaches and takes on an Old Testament prophet's voice. Eliot never does. Eliot is simply going to display reality and how we approach it as it actually is. Uh, he doesn't lecture us. He's not a rabble rouser. He'll speak of hellfire and damnation, but not as a fiery preacher. But what he does do is show everything. There is no Pollyanna escapism. There is no sweeping things under the rug. For Eliot, the pattern embraces everything. Garlic and sapphires, the circulation of the blood, the drift of stars, the pattern of the boar hunt, something probably not familiar with, as it was an early modern aristocratic pastime, but with its own pattern of the hounds being set out, the boar turning as it does, the hunters on their horses with the particular spears. Patterns, the dance, and reconciled among the stars. One of the ideas that you have in the pre-modern world, and this is absolutely the case in Dante and every other medieval poet, is that all of creation has a purpose, that God created everything to fill a particular role. And within that particular role, everything has its own harmony. The music of the spheres, the music that was assumed to be created by the celestial spheres rotating on each other in accordance with their own particular speed, their motion, the movement that is proper to them, the circulation of the blood here, a particular music, a harmony, a proportion, the movement of the boarhounds and the boar, functioning of the lymph system. All of these are parts of the same reality and part of the same pattern. But it's a pattern that, being part of creation, we cannot recognize. Reconciled among the stars from the highest perspective, the pattern would be visible. The pattern from God's perspective, of course, is perfectly rational, but it's a pattern that we can't see and that often seems chaotic. At the still point of the turning world, neither flesh nor fleshless, neither from nor towards, at the still point, there the dance is, but neither arrest nor movement. And do not call it fixity, where past and future are gathered. Neither movement from nor towards, neither ascent nor decline. Except for the point, the still point, there would be no dance. And there is only the dance. I can only say there we have been, but I cannot say where. And I cannot say how long, for that is to place it in time. The inner freedom from the practical desire, the release from action and suffering, release from the inner and the outer compulsion, yet surrounded by a grace of sense, a white light still and moving, erhebung without motion, concentration without elimination, both a new world and the old made explicit, understood in the completion of its partial ecstasy, the resolution of its partial horror. Yet the enchainment of past and future, woven in the weakness of the changing body, protects mankind from heaven and damnation, which flesh cannot endure. So we begin with all of these patterns that he summons up. And again, not symbols, but cases in point, examples of the harmonies of the dance. There is only the dance. And if you've read Dante in Paradiso, what do the souls do? They sing and they dance. All of heaven for Dante is a celestial dance. For Eliot as well, all of creation is a dance. And of course, we have to think back to a time when dance had particular steps that you followed, that you worked with a partner rather than just sort of random gyrations that could be confused with an epileptic fit. Um, the stately dance that is creation, which dances around that still point. It's not fixity. It's neither arrest nor movement. Um, the still point from which the dance, without the still point, there is no dance. Everything emanates from that still point, and everything is that dance. And what we have here is the still point, of course, is God, uh, that sets all of creation into motion, and all of creation is in motion in the dance, in the pattern, stemming from the divine mind, stemming from the divine end for which everything is created. You can't say where, you can't say when, because that still point is beyond space and time. The inner freedom from the practical desire. What is practical desire? The I wish this, I would have that. All of those things that the practical desire, where we limit our desires to just immediate wants, immediate needs. Those practical desires are the largest drag that we experience on our souls on a regular basis. Releasing ourselves from those desires, the release from action and suffering, from the inner and outer compulsion, yet surrounded by a grace of sense. So released from busyness that we have created, that we experience from others, with only grace, a white light still and moving. And here, if you've read Dante, you might think of that image from Paradiso 28, where Dante sees the celestial hierarchies of angels as these rings of flame circling around a point of infinite light. Concentration without elimination. Nothing gets swept under the rug. Everything is here. Everything in existence, concentrated into this pattern. Understood in the completion of its partial ecstasy and the resolution of its partial horror. Which is quite a thing to say, that whatever we experience on Earth is only partial horror. It seems callous, but it seems callous to disregard the horrors of World War II as only a partial horror from the standpoint of the still point, from the standpoint of eternity from God. That is only a partial horror. And of course, what we experience on Earth can only be partial ecstasy. We do not have the beatific vision on Earth. We might have glimpses, hints and guesses, he'll say later on. But only in that dance around that still point does the partialness of existence on Earth remove, and we see everything in fullness. Yet the enchainment of past and future, because past and future also have no significance for that point. And here we might think of Boethius describing what eternity is for God is everything in the same moment, the tota seeing everything at once, that past, present, and future are only distinctions that make sense to us as beings living in space and time. But for God outside of that, there cannot be past, present, or future. But the enchainment of past, present, and future, and the weakness of the changing body protects mankind from heaven and damnation, which flesh cannot endure. We might think, hold on, why would we want to be protected from heaven? Because mankind cannot bear much reality. With the thousand petty wants and desires we have in our life right now, could we bear the beatific vision of heaven? Could we bear the reality of eternal damnation? These are things that in our journey on this life we simply are not prepared for. Time past and time future allow but a little consciousness. To be conscious is not to be in time, but only in time can the moment in the rose garden, the moment in the arbor where the rain beat, the moment in the drafty church at smokefall be remembered, involved with past and future. Only through time, time is conquered. And so again, we have these moments, not symbols, but experiences um, in the rose garden, in the drafty church at smokefall. What even does that line mean, smokefall? The moments in which we have a glimpse into eternity, perhaps. We only get those as human beings passing through time. So again, what Eliot is proposing here is not some Gnostic or Neoplatonic avoidance of the world, avoidance of material reality, focus completely upon just the soul and thought. The body is bad, we have to abandon it. That's, I mean, it's never been the Catholic view at all, and it's certainly not Eliot's. Because to have the sacramental viewpoint requires embracing the material world, the world bound by space and time. Only through time, time is conquered. The time that moves on irrevocably, uh, we can only we can only transcend that by our actions in time. It's what we do as physical creatures, not just what we believe, but how we act through our experiences in this life. That's the only way that the horrors of time are overcome. Eructation of unhealthy souls into the faded air, the torpid driven on the wind that sweeps the gloomy hills of London, Hampstead, Clerkenwell, Camden, Putney, Highgate, Primrose, and Ludgate. Not here the darkness in this twittering world. But we don't want to conquer time through time. We have torpid crowds. What's listed here are not so much the neighborhoods of London, but the stops on the London Underground, the London subway. Not here the darkness in this twittering world. The darkness here is the darkness that we need, the darkness of the dark night of the soul, the darkness of St. John of the Cross, that you have to allow the darkness to come upon you to take the journey completely by faith without any guiding light, to test the faith in God. You can't have that in of my many favorite phrases of the four quartets, this twittering world. Mankind created to be reunited with God, but instead we twitter like the little birds and their song. And the song can be beautiful, but it's meaningless, utterly. This twittering world. And then, of course, with the advent of Twitter, it's almost a prophetic phase for what we have. Descend lower, descend only into the world of perpetual solitude. World not world, but that which is not world. Internal darkness, deprivation and destitution of all property, desiccation of the world of sense, evacuation of the world of fancy, inoperacy of the world of spirit. This is the one way, and the other is the same, not in movement, but abstention from movement, while the world moves in appetency on its meddled ways of time past and time future. So the only way through this twittering world of human distraction is to descend lower, just as Dante descends into the Inferno before he can rise up through purgatory. And all of these deprivation, destitution, desiccation, the internal darkness, the denial of, not the denial of material reality, but the denial of our desire for it. The world moves in appetency. I can't think of anywhere else in modern English where that word is used, but it's a very medieval word. It's just the state of having these desires, the appetites. The appetites were not just the appetite for food, but the appetite for everything, the appetite for everything sensual. So to move in appetency is to move aimlessly and blindly from one random desire to the next on its meddled ways. The meddled ways in England are just the asphalt paved roads of time past and time future. When you move in appetency, when you're chasing desires, it's the memory of things that we enjoyed in the past and the hope of enjoying them again in the future. But to move on in appetency is to be almost completely absent from present time. Time and the bell have buried the day. The black cloud carries the sun away. Will the sunflower turn to us? Will the clematis stray down, bend to us, tendril and spray, clutch and cling? Chill fingers of you be curled down on us? After the kingfisher's wing has answered light to light and is silent, the light is still at the still point of the turning world. The fourth part of each, sorry, the fourth part of each of the four poems is a short lyrical poem. And it introduces something that is harsh, and this one introduces death. Time and the bell have buried the day, the black cloud carries the sun away. Will the sunflower turn to us? It turns to the sun. Will it turn to us? Will the clematis stray down, bend to us? The clematis vines climb up. Will the clematis stray down to us when we are under the ground? Will the tendril and spray clutch and cling when we are in the dirt? Chill fingers of yew. The yew tree in England, it is pretty much always associated with the graveyards of churches. So will the roots of the yew tree curl down to us in our graves? After the kingfisher's wing has answered light to light. So the kingfisher is again another bird that I don't actually know from real life, but I have read about. And the point of the kingfisher is that it's a chatty bird that swoops down just over the surface of mountain streams. And mountain streams are pretty much always covered up by shadow because of the trees that grow thick in riparian zones. So you have little darts of light that come in here and there through the branches. And the kingfisher's wing answers light on light when it reflects one of those beams of light that beats through the forest and strikes it. And then the kingfisher's gone, and there's no more light reflecting that light, and the sound of the kingfisher's gone. And we have silence. The light is still at the still point of the turning world. Words move, music moves, only in time, but that which is only living can only die. And for a poet, of course, to say words move and music moves, poetry is supposed to be read aloud, not silent. And as I say these words aloud, we understand them in time. You hear the syllables one after another and string sense out of them. Or depending on how we read Eliot, we don't get too much sense out of them. But only in time. And then the words are silent. That which is only living can only die. Which sounds fairly obvious. But we tend to ignore that second only. That which is only living can die. We acknowledge that everything does die. But that applies to us and to everything that we know. We do our best to push that back and ignore it. Poets don't say anything new. There's nothing new to say, especially if the poet is speaking of salvation. The road to salvation has never changed. What poets do is say that which has always been known in a way that is arresting and hopefully shakes us out of our torpor to recognize what we know and benefit from it. Only by the form, the pattern, can words or music reach the stillness. As a Chinese jar still moves perpetually in its stillness. So the Chinese jar here, you have to think of the patterns that appear on vases, the delightful patterns that are so intricate and delicate, but seem to be moving. So even though the Chinese porcelain jar is still, it seems to be in perpetual movement, which is completely different from the stillness of the violin while the note lasts. Not that only, but the coexistence. The violin plays a note and then is still, but the note dies. You no longer hear it. But this image of the Chinese jar, something that moves perpetually while remaining still, that the two coexist in a way that sound, whether words or music, does not. Or say that the end precedes the beginning, and the beginning and the end were always there, before the beginning and after the end. And all is always there. Words strain, crack, and sometimes break under the burden, under the tension, slip, slide, perish, decay with imprecision, will not stay in place, will not stay still. Shrieking voices, scolding, mocking, or merely chattering, always assails them. The word in the desert is most attacked by voices of temptation. The crying shadow in the funeral dance, the loud lament of the disconsolate chimera. And so now Eliot reflects on the words that he uses to create poetry. And we can't think of this as the poet complaining about how hard it is to do what he does. The poet has words as his medium, but they're not, the words cannot be separate from the message that the poet has itself. And if we think about this in other terms, imagine Michelangelo sculpting, and he's sculpting out of marble. Is there a difference between sculpted marble and the David? In terms of form and content, we might be able to analyze it logically, but it would make no sense to say that there's a significant difference between the marble as sculpted and the statue David. When the poet makes the poetry, the poet uses words, but perfects, pushes them to their absolute limit. And sometimes they break and crack under the burden that the poet would put them under. So in this poem that he is creating, he's creating something that will exist for salvation. His goal and Dante's are exactly the same. that he can lead the reader to salvation. He has to do it in completely different terms. Dante is writing in a Christian society that is largely grown immune to the Christian message. Eliot is writing to a society that no longer even wants to accept it. And here we might think of G.K. Chesterton, that Christianity has not been tried and found wanting, it's been found difficult and not tried. It's been found difficult and not tried, so it can't be accepted again. So what Eliot has to do, it's the same role as Dante, but it's completely different. And though they're both fashioning with words, they both face different problems of trying to use words to create something that can bring the reader to salvation. But the words won't stay in place, will not stay still, decay with imprecision. A point that comes up later is that poetry is absolutely essential to language, that poetry is what distills language. It refines language as a fire does. But then it's used, and the daily use puts these slides of meaning and imprecision that decays the words that have been written. Once the poetry has been written, it's immediately obsolete. But the poet has to fight against that. And Eliot, again, is not saying this to draw attention to himself as a poet, but to draw attention to what he is trying to do in preparing a path to salvation. The detail of the pattern is movement. As in the figure of the 10 stairs, desire itself is movement, not in itself desire. Love is itself unmoving. Desire is movement, something Dante literally says, desio è moto spirituale, desire is spiritual movement, he says. But desire itself is not desire. Desire is a desire for love. It's a movement towards something, towards love, but love itself is unmoved. Only the cause and end of movement. Desire is our motion towards something that we hope is love. Timeless and undesiring, except in the aspect of time, caught in the form of limitation between unbeing and being. Sudden in a shaft of sunlight, even while the dust moves, there rises the hidden laughter of children in the foliage. Quick now, here, now, always. Ridiculous, the waste, sad time stretching before and after. And we come back a little bit here at the end. Speaking of desire and love, the desire that's motion towards love that is still. And love that gets caught in the aspect of time when something moves towards it in desiring, caught in the form of limitation between unbeing and being. Because desire is desire for something that exists concretely, but the love that we would hope to have in that thing is immaterial. Then we come back to the sudden shaft of sunlight, sudden in a shaft of sunlight, while the dust moves, and the hidden laughter of children in the foliage. So we go back to the garden that we began with. Quick now, here now, always. Ridiculous, the waste, sad time stretching before and after. And we'll pause there for a second because, wow, I've been speaking for an hour now to get us through just our first poem. And that's with having missed a section that apparently did not get copied and pasted into the notes. This is the end of part 2. There's another 15 lines of text that lead before eructation. Those didn't quite get copied, and that would have been part 3 of Burning. If there's any questions, I'll take those now as I try to decide what can we do in the final half hour here. I think what I'll do is continue the slow reading of this to make sense of it. Certainly won't be able to get through even all of the next part in half an hour, but I will continue lecturing on this. I'll record the lectures that go through the rest of this, because to hurry the four quartets is worse than to not do it at all. And I'll try to remember in the future not to plan so much in so little time. So if there's any questions in the chat or question and answer, I'm happy to deal with those. I'm going to put a link into chat if you like this. By far in my mind, by far the best guide to the four quartets um, is Thomas Howard's Descending Dove. It's a reading of it from the Catholic standpoint, without which it makes no sense whatsoever. But it's written for the reader that just wants to like the poetry. T.S. Eliot is like Dante, that there are a ton of critics that write about them to death, and most of what they have to say is not worth the effort of reading. But this short book, it's I think 120 pages, absolutely is. And so T.S. Eliot, as I said, but I don't think I made explicit, is a convert to Christianity. He's also a convert to being English. He's born in Missouri, ends up studying in Harvard, goes to England in 1908, I think, and then stays there for the next 20 years. In 1927, he converts to Christianity, for which he was roundly criticized. He was creating the artistic, poetic movement of modernism, and it was a very decidedly atheistic. T.S. Eliot, one of the sins for which he's purging himself now is certainly unleashing Ezra Pound on the world. Ezra Pound had a stupid little rhyming couplet when T.S. Eliot converted, something about feeling horror at all of those who abandoned the muses for Moses. I don't think anybody really needs to take criticism from a literal fascist like Ezra Pound. What happened with T.S. Eliot is that he took modernism as far as it could possibly go, and as far as it can go, basically is the wasteland. This self-referentialism of modernism. The idea of modernism that we can, just in the here and now, ignoring everything else that's ever happened in human history, and ignoring the possibility of a future, not saying that it can't exist, but refusing to even talk about it at all. It leads to nothing but the horrors of the 20th century. And Eliot got to that point by 1927. And so he didn't convert to Roman Catholicism. He was brought into the Church of England and described himself as Anglo-Catholic. It was said of him that he exhausted his capacity for conversion in becoming English, so he could only make it quite to Anglo-Catholicism. His view in terms of doctrine is entirely Catholic. It's just a bit of his adopted English nationalism that prevents him from accepting Roman Catholicism. And if you're familiar with Dante at all, you can see that just in the first part, how much of a reader Eliot is of Dante. there's allusions here and there, but above all, he understood Dante's project of trying to present to a people for whom Christianity has grown lukewarm the fervor of what Christianity is, of what it means to fully accept the gospel, that it requires a complete conversion. The life before cannot be the same as the life after, that one has to be on fire. One has to be inflamed by the Holy Spirit. It's not something one can do on Sundays and then go about living the rest of the week. It's an utter change. The Greek metanoia, the changing of the noia, the mind itself. And that's what Eliot does in these poems. How do we present the conversion for absolute change, absolute submission to the will of God that is required? Like Dante, he believes in joy. That is not the passing fancy that you get in this world, this material world, and the little desires that we chase after here and there. Money, a car, an attractive mate, a great job, fame, etc. None of those produce joy. And that's why he describes appetency as the past and future. It's utterly unfulfilling in the present. When I'm talking to high school students, I always talk about that feeling on Christmas morning after you've unwrapped the last present, where there's a sort of almost angry despair that there's nothing left to have, but you're immediately unsatisfied with everything that you've just received because there's nothing new that you're getting. A feeling that you don't want to share with anybody else, but how pretty much all children feel after they've unwrapped their last present. Well, that's how everybody feels for everything that they go through in life, because they cannot provide joy. Man is made for joy. That joy can only be experienced in God. But we can only experience that joy in God by abandoning every other joy that is not God. Not abandoning the world, but putting it into its proper place. Having our desires, having our loves be properly directed. The message of Augustine, the message of Dante, the message that the modern world absolutely does not want to hear, as it does everything it can to numb itself from that reality. And since we're going to do, I think it makes the most sense to do the complete reading. Let me go ahead and take 1 minute to grab the section that got skipped over, because it's a beautiful section and the rest of Bert Norton cannot make sense without it. Here is a place of disaffection, time before and time after, in a dim light. Neither daylight investing form with lucid stillness, turning shadow into transient beauty, with slow rotation suggesting permanence, nor darkness to purify the soul, emptying the sensual with deprivation, cleansing affection from the temporal. So this is what we have in this world. And here's something that I skipped over. There, Eliot puts as an epigraph to this work, two quotations from Heraclitus, the pre-Socratic philosopher. And the second of those two is that the way up and the way down are the same. And how that plays out for Eliot here is the way up is the via positiva, the way of God, uh, by embracing the joy that is God, the via negativa, the removing of everything else, the reordering of all of our loves, that way going down that Eliot speaks of before he comes to this third section. But what we have in this world is neither. We don't have daylight investing form with lucid stillness turning shadow into transient beauty with slow rotation suggesting permanence. We don't have light that brings our thoughts to God and that still point that is the focus of the dance in existence. We also don't have the darkness that purifies the soul, emptying the sensual with deprivation, cleansing affection from the temple, losing our desires for all these fleeting pleasures. Neither plenitude nor vacancy, only a flicker over the strained, time-ridden faces, distracted from distraction by distraction, filled with fancies and empty of meaning, tumid apathy with no concentration, men and bits of paper whirled by the cold wind that blows before and after time, wind in and out of unwholesome lungs, time before and after. Neither plenitude nor vacancy. Instead, what do we have? The time-ridden faces of people distracted from distraction by distraction. And that is, if it was true in the 40s, even more so today. The complaints that you hear everywhere of people on their phones. You don't even see the strained, time-ridden faces anymore because as you ride on the subway or the bus today, all faces are looking down, hidden from everybody else, buried in their phone. And on that phone, the phone itself is a distraction, but as they scroll endlessly, the original distraction itself isn't enough. We need to be distracted from something else by scrolling onto something new. We need the constant distraction from distraction, filled with fancies and empty of meaning. Tumid apathy. So the apathy itself is pathological. Empty of meaning, no concentration. Men and bits of paper whirled by the cold wind that blows before and after. So you see the bits of paper blown by on the streets of cities and people with their empty expression of time-ridden faces blown along the same way, empty of meaning and without concentration. Wind in and out of unwholesome lungs. The cold wind that wind out of unwholesome lungs, time before and after. That is the eructation of unhealthy souls into the faded air. The torpid, we understand crowds driven on the wind that sleeps the gloomy hills of London. And then here, all of these lines make sense since we're talking about all of the people and their blank expressions as they ride through the London Underground on their way home. So the second part, East Coker. All of the places are significant to Eliot. East Coker is where he traces ancestral line. The Eliots drew their origins in America to the 1670s, um, and before that, they immigrated from East Coker. In my beginning is my end. In succession, houses rise and fall, crumble, are extended. are removed, destroyed, restored, or in their place is an open field or a factory or a bypass. So, in my beginning is my end. He's playing with here the last word of Mary, Queen of Scots, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon from Henry VIII. Bloody Mary, the Catholic queen who tried to undo Henry VIII's Protestant Reformation, who ended up failing and herself was beheaded. As she was on the scaffold, her final words were, "In my end is my beginning," that in my death, I'm born into real life. Um, Eliot takes that here, and with the logic that we saw before of time past and time present, in my beginning is my end. That which is only living can only die. Everything that is living has a purpose to fulfill, but on this earth, everything that is living will die. And so, in my beginning is my end. In succession, houses rise and fall. And houses here, of course, have the dual meaning, that ambiguity that he plays on. Both the physical structures, like the mansion of Burnt Norton, but also royal houses, houses of families that rise and fall and go extinguished. They can be restored, or in their place is an open field or a factory or a bypass. And there's something about the bypass that just hammers home the vacuousness that we have in life here, that houses are destroyed to create a street that allows us to go somewhere else faster by not going where the original street went. Old stone to new building, old timber to new fires, old fires to ashes, and ashes to the earth, which is already flesh, fur, and feces, bone of man and beast, cornstalk and leaf. Again, with Eliot, there's no sweeping things under the rug. We have these cycles of generation and destruction. And the earth itself is flesh, fur, and feces. It is living things that die and decompose. And that which they eat and passes through them and goes into and becomes the earth. Bone of man and beast, cornstalk and leaf. Houses live and die. There is a time for building and a time for living and for generation, and a time for the wind to break the loosened pane, and to shake the wainscot where the field mouse trots, and to shake the tattered arras woven with a silent motto. And so here we have an image of the old English house that's now been abandoned. Uh, and so eventually the wind breaks the window pane, the windows in their pane, and the wainscot, the very high decorative floor trim that goes up 3 feet or so. That is shaken, and the field mouse that trots behind it in the walls, and to shake the tattered arras, and the arras is a tapestry with a silent motto. So this was a family of one of those houses of, a royal house, a house of nobility that would have had their family motto embroidered on the tapestry hanging on the wall that is now shaken and tattered. And of course, a time for building, a time for living and for generation, a time for the wind. We're in Ecclesiastes, book of Kohelet, that is one of the most beautiful and challenging books of the Old Testament. Um, because much like Eliot, Ecclesiastes challenges the idea that wisdom can bring peace and happiness in this life, that ultimately there's only the will of God. And then, of course, it's turned into that song by the Birds. In my beginning is my end. Now the light falls across the open field, leaving the deep lane shuttered with branches, dark in the afternoon, where you lean against a bank while a van passes. and the deep lane insists on the direction into the village. In the electric heat, hypnotized. In a warm haze, the sultry light is absorbed, not refracted by Greystone. The dolly is asleep in empty silence, wait for the early hour. And so here we're referring to those the English country roads that are very narrow and have these ancient embankments up on the side, such that if you're walking by, uh, if a large truck passes, you have to lean up against the bank to avoid it. And the deep lane insists on the direction into the village. And the sultry light, the warm haze, is absorbed by the gray stone of these houses that are fallen and crumbling. In that open field, if you do not come too close, if you do not come too close, on a summer midnight, you can hear the music of the weak pipe and the little drum, and see them dancing around the bonfire. And here he summons up this image of medieval festival, the medieval village coming, the farming village coming together at the height of summer and having the dancing around the bonfire. The association of man and woman in dancing, signifying matrimony, a dignified and commodious sacrament. Two and two necessary conjunction, holding each other by the hand or the arm, which betokeneth concord. And so here in East Coker, which he associates with his past, he's quoting directly from the 17th century Bishop of Ely and Winchester, Lancelot Andrewes, who has these lines, but Lancelot Andrewes is taking these lines and paraphrasing Sir Thomas Eliot uh, from 1531, who wrote a book on the sacraments, and he's describing matrimony as a dance. That as there are steps and there are give and take in matrimony, it's not in successful matrimony. It's not that somebody gets everything that they want all of the time, not the absurd love fantasies that are taught to us, but it's a step back and a step forward. The two have to move together as partners. And so dancing signifies matrimony, signifies what it is to be husband and wife, moving together in arrangement, in a pattern. Bringing us into a sacrament, bringing us into a dance, bringing us into the age-old patterns of England and Eliot's home. Round and round the fire, leaping through the flames or joined in circles, rustically solemn or in rustic laughter. And when Eliot uses this word solemn, he's using it in its early modern, old Middle English sense of that which is joyous, but also serious. The opposite of solemnity is frivolity, entertainment that has no deeper purpose, that is superficial. What is solemn is what is joyful but meaningful. And what is meaningful can only be that which points to that still point, which in some way brings us to God. Lifting heavy feet in clumsy shoes, earth feet, loam feet, lifted in country mirth. So the peasants in their literal clodhoppers caked with mud, mirth of those long since under earth. And again, that earth which is already flesh, fur, and feces, bone of man and beast. Mirth of those long since under earth, nourishing the corn, keeping time, keeping the rhythm in their dancing, as in their living in the living seasons. The time of the seasons and of the constellations, the time of milking and the time of harvest, the time of the coupling of man and woman, and that of beasts, feet rising and falling, eating and drinking, dung and death. So again, Eliot is never going to let us off the hook. We have the celebration that should be celebrated. Um, it signifies a sacrament. And those who had danced this in the past are now long since under the earth, nourishing corn, keeping time, keeping the rhythm in their dancing as in their living. Uh, that the mortal remains are still part of this pattern. What they left behind while their souls go elsewhere continues to be part of the dance of creation of life on earth. And again, the time of this, the time of that, the time of coupling of man and woman, and that of the beasts. Feet rising and falling in the dance, eating and drinking, but also dung and death. It's all one. It all has to be included. Dawn points and another day prepares for heat and silence. Out at sea, the dawn wind wrinkles and slides. I am here or there or elsewhere in my beginning. And so we've reached 8 o'clock. And we've gotten through, there's 20 total parts, 5 parts each to the 4 poems, and we had enough time to get through 6 of them. I hope you can understand my decision to go through the 6 slowly and to try to comment on them to make sense of them. Eliot is far more like Dante than he is like Tolkien. Tolkien you can read on your own and understand and enjoy. Eliot you can read on your own and enjoy even if you don't understand all of it. Again, the words individually all make sense. How he strung them together is what the problem is. So I hope my decision to go through it slowly has made some sense. And I think what I will do here is continue this reading through the summer, and I'll continue to send links. If anybody would continue to like to hear these sessions, I'll continue to keep the Zoom classroom going. I think, yeah, I'll do this throughout June. I won't be able to do it the first week of June, but after that, I'll continue. That's the idea that makes the most sense to me. I hope you can appreciate my reasoning, if nothing else. And so officially this ends the class. But as it should be, it doesn't. Because the literature that we have here, the Catholic imagination, and I think in Eliot's 4 quartets, you can see how the Catholic imagination remains the same throughout all of the centuries, even though the form it takes has to modify itself to the particular century that needs its message. So on that we'll end. I thank you very much for this course. I'll send out an email with this recording and with how we'll go from here. So thank you all very much for listening all year. I've enjoyed this class, even as I, like the houses of East Coker, the syllabus was removed, destroyed, restored, and put in its place with something else that made better sense at the time. So thank you, all of you, for partaking.